welcome back to the next video in our series where we look at Auto 5s, the guns that the Browning Auto 5 inspired, the guns that were sort of knocked off of it, the guns that were intended to compete with it but used some part or some inspiration from the Auto 5's original design. Today we're looking at another Model 11, only this is the Winchester model of 1911, not the Remington model of 1911. And this gun has a lot to be said about it. I know Matthias of CN Arsenal is working on a video that dives more into the history, so I'm going to try and let that be his domain, and I'm trying to only touch on the points that are fairly well established, because there are a lot of things about this shotgun's history that aren't terribly well established. And Matthias' video, I'm sure, will go ahead and wade through the disinformation around this gun and try and get as much of it as it can correct. So, the Winchester Model 1911. This shotgun was designed by sort of Winchester's genius shotgun designer after Winchester realized that Browning's Auto 5 was actually a success. And as mentioned in the Auto 5 video, Browning and Winchester had a pretty big falling out about the Auto 5 because Browning wanted a royalty for the design and Winchester said that wouldn't happen. And as Browning's Auto 5 appeared to be pretty successful and automatic shotguns seemed like they were a growing market in the US, Winchester realized they probably needed to cut in, lest they get left behind. Of course, Browning had patents on most of the systems that made the Auto 5 the excellent gun it was, chiefly a charging handle on the bolt, but also the friction ring system underneath the handguard. Winchester had to make a gun that didn't rely on these, and it was going to have to try really, really hard to catch up with where Browning was. Now, spoiler alert, they did never really catch up with where Browning was, but they did do a pretty admirable job. They at least fought back with a shotgun that, no matter how you want to spin it, has some fundamental flaws to the way it operates. I'll go ahead and address the elephant in the room, of course. This is blue. The reason this is blue is because it is 3D printed. The original forend for this gun I do have. This is obviously a very, very old gun, but the forends on these guns split, and they split very frequently and very dramatically. The reason for that is because, as mentioned, they don't have the friction ring system under the handguard that the Auto 5 did. They were also not using, it would seem, as high quality wood, and they didn't have any reinforcements in the handguard to sort of prevent it from splitting. So anytime that you find Winchester 1911s, inspect the handguards closely, because almost invariably they will have small cracks, and those small cracks eventually become big cracks and it becomes a split in half handguard. However, this 3D printed handguard has held up now for a couple hundred rounds. It seems like it's doing great at this point. So I'm going to stick with the blue handguard on this gun for now. My original handguard is about to split into two pieces, and so it's sort of out of commission at this point. Additionally, the stocks on these guns were sort of made out of three pieces. You had a center piece of wood and then the two side pieces that were then all glued together. You'll commonly find them with the side pieces trying to become unglued together, both due to age and due to recoil, because of course the stock's trying to get split in half the way that they're glued together because of the fact that this gun doesn't have a friction ring system, among other things. So right off the bat, probably the biggest design flaw of the gun is the friction ring system. We will take this gun a little bit further apart than we have with some of the guns so far, and the reason for that is to sort of see how Winchester pulled off some of what it pulled off, because while this gun does have a fair amount in common with the Auto 5, it's actually surprisingly unique. I know a lot of people refer to this gun as just being an Auto 5 that you cock differently, but that's not actually true. Winchester did have a prototype of this gun that was literally an Auto 5 that you cocked differently, but the gun that you see here is substantially different, and I think my easiest way to evidence that is, let's count the screws on the receiver. Well, Winchester did maybe one thing right. There aren't screws on the receiver. That's kind of cool. The way they pulled that off wasn't that cool whenever it comes time to disassemble and detail strip the gun. These guns are kind of a nightmare to detail strip because it's a bunch of springs retaining steel pieces inside of slots on the inside of the receiver. And by the time you're done screwing with those springs and having them pop out of the gun for the 50th time, you sit there going, I think I'd rather just do 20 screws to take this gun apart, actually. But this is then the story, right? That's the experience of having one of these Winchester 1911s. So, to sort of get to the other big issue of this gun, right? No charging handle. Browning has a patent on the charging handle. Winchester needs to make an automatic shotgun. Browning also had a patent for cocking the gun using a mechanism in the stock, so that's out for Winchester as well. The system they come up with is frankly not bad until you have a jam. And then once you have a jam, you realize exactly how stupid this system is. And in fact, true to form, this shotgun does have some cycling issues that we may run into in the shooting segment, and we'll be able to see exactly why those cycling issues pose a problem on this gun, and we'll address those in sufficient detail as we come across them. But the way that you actually cock this shotgun then is this knurled section out here on the barrel. A lot of people point to this as being unsafe or ungainly. It's definitely ungainly. It's potentially unsafe, but I think it's only unsafe in the manner that if you're being stupid, the gun will allow you to hurt yourself, but this is true of guns in general. There's plenty of ways to deal with this front cocking system that don't involve you hurting yourself or anyone around you. You'll also find a ton of references online to these guns slam firing. As best I can tell, what they're referring to is the gun putting a round in the chamber when people didn't expect it to do that. And as we'll see here in a second, as we sort of go through the manual of arms, we will see how that's possible. However, the slam firing that people refer to, I don't think that actually involves the gun firing whenever it chambers around. I think there's referring to the fact that it chambers around whenever you don't expect it to. Because, of course, this toggle here on the receiver is sort of the key to understanding the manual of arms on the Winchester. And it's not extremely intuitive, and on most of them that I've handled, it's a really stiff, positive, clicky button, so you might not even think it's a button right off the bat. But in order to cycle this gun, of course, we grab out here on the barrel and pull it back. It'll be tricky for me to show this to the camera. I'll see if I can do it like this one time. Yeah, that's pretty difficult. But really, you're supposed to do it off of your hip and not sort of between your two hands. Between your two hands, it's a pretty serious amount of force in that recoil spring. But then off of our hip here, maybe I'll stand up so the camera can see the action there. You pull the barrel back till it clicks, and that's this latch holding the, well, this latch either holding the bolt back or not, but with it set up this way, as the barrel goes forward, ooh, it'll make your ears ring as it happens. The bolt jumps forward whenever the barrel comes into battery, because with the gun set in this position, that's sort of your regular cycling position. With the button set the other way, the bolt will stay back after the gun is fired. This works whenever there's shells in the gun, so this is sort of an interrupt. It locks the bolt back every time you have this switch engaged. Every shot, it will lock the bolt back. If you don't have this button locked back, the gun will not lock back, not even on empty. So counting your shells is important unless you want to be jerking the gun off every so often whenever the gun runs dry. Sort of a interesting thing that you can get used to, but it is a little strange, and it does get tiring after a while of, like, for example, if you shoot trap with this thing, you'll, wow, that's loud. You'll shoot the gun, and then every time that you chamber around, you'll have to hit the button back, fire, you hit the button back, fire the gun, it will lock back. Now the gun will close, be ready to fire, but before you fire it, you have to hit the button back. So you're going to be toggling this button constantly, 2 times for every 1 shot you fire. If you're doing something like shooting trap, where you're only ever putting 1 round in at a time, it becomes exhausting very quickly. One advantage, however, to the way that this system works is that this gun can be loaded straight into the magazine without needing to press a button on the outside of the gun. It's pretty nifty in the way that it does this, because the system is sort of got 2 places that you can actually let shells sit on the lifter. It's a very interesting design, where if you go to feed 1 round in, you only push it in that far, and then you can get your next round in, and then your next round in, and you can continue loading it until you're happy with how many rounds are in there, and you push that round all the way in. The lifter will come up, and then the shell stop on the bolt is much further back on these guns, but this is then the loaded position of the shell. Unloading can be done pretty much the opposite way, like so. And frankly, unloading this shotgun is really, really easy thanks to that mechanism. Of course, loading it is then still pretty tricky, and you can load the gun by just putting 4 in the tube and then racking it off the barrel and then putting 1 more in the tube, which is pretty nifty, but it's just a little bit of a wonky system, what with having to get out there and pull on the barrel to cock it. One thing that this gun did, and this was advertised at great length, is that because of the system right at the split of the receivers, it has an upper receiver and sort of a lower receiver trigger group system, and they're held together by this thumb screw that has a lock here. You can depress the lock and then undo the thumb screw. And it'll keep going, keep going, keep going. And then at this point, you can pull the gun in half. So takedown on this thing is actually really, really quick as far as this sort of a takedown goes. The trigger mechanism on this gun we'll talk about in a later video. It's really, really funky, and it doesn't work in a way that's intuitive whatsoever. It took me like 2 hours of sitting there studying this trigger group to figure out why they did it this way and how they did it this way. It makes sense after you sit there and think about it for a while, but good lord. And potentially even there may have been patents involved, because I think Browning's double hook system was still patented at the time this gun was around. So they came up with a very more different trigger group. We can set that to the side for now. Of course, the stock does come off that trigger group, but because that's meant to be the takedown and the stock isn't meant to come off normally, as on the Brownings, the action spring that's housed in that stock is really stiff and it really wants to come out of there. So if we eventually get around to doing a detailed strip video on this shotgun, I'm not excited to mess around with that. But then we have our upper receiver assembly here. Of course, getting the bolt out is still a little tricky. You do still have to take the handguard off. But if you were to do a race, getting the bolt out of this compared to an Auto 5, it is actually a little bit easier here, as long as you're sort of willing to get in there with a couple of fiddly tools and poke around at things. You end up needing punches and pliers and more tools than with the Auto 5, where you just need a screwdriver and then a punch, I guess, as well as a hammer way to drive something. But frankly, I don't hate the way this shotgun takes down to get the bolt out. But taking down the shotgun all the way is a real pain because of the way these mechanisms on the inside of the gun are sort of held together. But this is sort of the basic level of stripping. I will go one step further to show you. I think the biggest flaw of this gun's design is that the barrel, handguard, and magazine tube assembly are one assembly. They're all held together as though they were one part. And while these guns originally came with sort of a spanner wrench to access these holes to take this handguard off, for our purposes today we'll just use a little bit of threaded rod like a pin punch and walk this off. Additionally, while the Auto 5, right, it had its friction ring system, and that was sort of its claim to fame as how well that friction system worked, it did need adjusting, right? If you're going to go light loads to heavy loads, you'd have to take the handguard off and flip a ring around. And Winchester capitalized on this in marketing by saying that this gun will handle any loads, any configuration, no problem. You don't have to jack with setting up rings, none of that crap. But sort of the thing they weren't telling you then is you could do that with an Auto 5, just take the friction rings out, and then it works much like this gun does. And this gun claims to have recoil reducing buffers in the system that stops the gun from battering itself. And these buffers were originally made out of like almost a compressed cardboard sort of material. In fact, they may have even been asbestos based. I'm not really sure entirely, but they're like a very hard very hard cardboard material. The sort of surprising thing, though, is that when the barrel recoils, it doesn't touch these pads. It doesn't bottom out on these pads. As best I can tell, the reason those rings were in the gun was to make it so the recoil spring, if it was to try to kink on its way back, it would sort of compress these pads instead of kink out to break the handguard. But that's a guess. I'm really not sure what those pads specifically were in the gun for, because they do not serve any sort of buffering purpose, because the barrel does not bottom out against them. What bottoms out first is the bolt against the back of the receiver before the barrel ever has an opportunity to bottom out against the recoil pads. And there is also a little recoil pad insert in the bolt itself. It would work as a buffer, but it's tiny and it's not going to do a very good job of that. The buffers under the handguard don't do anything, and in fact this gun's currently running 3D printed TPU buffers. And I even increased the size of the buffers to make it so the barrel did bottom out on them, and it did make the recoil feel a little better. It also made it so it was almost impossible to cock the gun by hand, because you have to compress those buffers by hand. And if you make the recoil buffers stiff enough that they're going to stop recoil, they're going to be way too stiff to allow you to cock the gun off of the barrel. And so what I had to do on that particular gun was take the gun and then straight down as hard as I could with energy, like the gun had been fired, in order to get it cocked. And at that point, it's really not a very safe system. So that's my spiel as far as the rings on here, and I would like to take the thing all the way apart in this video to show you that. But getting the rings out of this gun is a very in-depth process. It's not fun by any means. So at this point, we actually have to get our bolt separated from our barrel. So I'll do that here. There we go. Got our bolt and barrel separated. Obviously, if they're locked together, the barrel's not going to come out of the front of the gun. And here is our front end assembly for this thing. There's a snap ring and a ring that's threaded around here that have to compress the buffer pads that then compresses the mainspring against the front of the handguard, against the barrel in front of handguard out here. It's a really jacked up system, and I cannot express my displeasure with this design fiercely enough. It's really, really just not good. The fact that it's all in one unit, that's great. It's nifty. Getting in there to deal with anything, though, is now very difficult. It involves the use of a special tool. I had to make a special tool to be able to get that in and out. It's not very intuitive, and certainly before the internet, woe on any gunsmith that didn't have a special tool that had to figure out how this system here actually works. So I am not a fan of this whole assembly thing here, but it is what it is. I'll set that to the side there. We can look once more at our receiver. Got to jack around with the levers on the inside so I can get the bolt to go back forward. So one thing that's very interesting about this gun, I'd mentioned before, it's not really all that Auto 5 on the inside. You can see that immediately in the locking system here. The locking system is quite different. The bolt sort of has a toggle on it instead of it being, the Browning has a system where the locking piece swoops up based on the angle of the tail on the carrier. The Winchester here relies on sort of a toggle. It's an interesting system, and I think I will pull the bolt out of this receiver really quick just to sort of show you guys that, because it is pretty interesting. Alright, there we go. That's sort of the expedient way to get the bolt out of the gun. Of course, there's still a lot of parts in there, and those parts don't want to come out easily, but here we are with our bolt. And here you can see our bolt tail is here. Our locking bit, our locking guy is there. And obviously the way this works is as the bolt comes forward, eventually the angle on the recoil spring, because obviously the recoil spring, the action spring, rather, is at an angle. And as the bolt comes forward, the angle on that changes, and eventually it wants to force this locking dugger to come up like that. And it sort of acts not quite as a toggle. It's not really a true toggle, but the way it works is sort of like that. And then actually this entire toggle comes out of the gun and is what retains the firing pin. Again, we're getting a little bit more into detail strip than we did on the Auto 5, so you'll have to take my word for it, but getting the firing pin out of the Auto 5 is substantially harder. So getting into the bolt on the Winchester 1911 is substantially easier, but I don't want to make that sound like it is easy. It's not quite. But there is your sort of locking system here on the Winchester. And this does sort of act as an out-of-battery system as well, where the firing pin is covered by the bolt tail until the locking lug comes up, and then the firing pin is exposed, and the hammer can hit it. There's your system like that, and then you can see how this would come in here, and then through that window, the locking lug pops up. Pretty cool. And then, of course, in reverse, whenever this comes to the end of the receiver and the bolt gets locked back, the barrel can pull forward, and the locking lug can pop down. And that is thanks to, at the end of travel, the angle on this tail is much lower, as opposed to here, it's trying to push it up. When it comes all the way to the back, it's trying to pull it down. Sort of an interesting way that system works there. Not entirely dissimilar in the tail regard to the Auto 5, but the actual way it locks is different, and the entire way this bolt works then is different. And so, the designer of the Winchester 1911, who's one T.C. Johnson, working at Winchester, I think he deserves credit. I think some shade is thrown his way for the fact that this gun obviously has some oversights, but considering the constraints he was working in, he came up with a really pretty darn good shotgun design, especially considering it's not like he just took an Auto 5 and knocked it off the bare minimum. there were things about this shotgun that I think were hands down improvements, at least from a marketability standpoint, to the Auto 5. Namely, no screws on the receiver looks good. I think the 1911 looks better than an Auto 5 from a streamlined standpoint. I think the Auto 5 wins for it being a little bit more humped back, and I think it wins for it's just such a classic looking gun, and this gun doesn't. It looks different enough that this gun isn't classic looking. But I think if you're to stop and compare the two, this was a more forward-thinking design than Browning's just cover it in screws, people will buy this shit anyway approach to having designed the thing. But this is the inner workings here on our Winchester 1911 as far as we're going to get into them now. We'll go ahead and have to put this thing back together, and then we'll close up this section of the video and then go and shoot the thing. Okay, and there we've got the silly thing back together here, ready to put the lower back on the upper. And of course the action spring plunger there has to line up with the knob that hangs off the back of the gun. It can be a little tricky to get lined up sometimes. The receivers fit together, and the steel, it's open here on the bottom of the upper, and then the lower slides into there, but the upper is ever so slightly concave, at least on this gun, so that the fit between the parts is really good, but that means that you do have to sort of muscle them together as you go. That gets us to here. We can do up our thumb screw. Push our receivers together. I'll take it off camera real quick, just to make sure it's all the way tightened up. There we go. And that's one reassembled Winchester shotgun. And we'll go ahead and do a really quick functions check here. Alright, bolt stays back. Hold my ears for this because it is loud. Bolt goes forward, and then with the bolt in the fire position, we'll go ahead and shut it just to make sure it works correctly, and there we go. That is one reassembled Winchester shotgun. It's ready to go for our shooting section, where hopefully we'll be able to see one of the jams that this particular model anyway likes to do, and we'll be able to show how having knurling on the barrel isn't such a bad idea until you have to deal with the gun in the middle of a malfunction after you've been shooting it. Alright, we got ourselves some pretty decent weather today, and we've brought along a Winchester. This is our, of course, Winchester 1911 with our 3D printed forend, and we'll be looking for a couple of things today. I guess right off the bat, I'll be sticking to light loads because this thing kicks plenty hard with light loads, let alone with heavy loads. As usual disclaimer, we're shooting very close to where the targets are being thrown from. This is so that the camera can see the gun and the thrower and the target to make it a little bit easier for the viewer to track, because it's hard to track birds in the first place, especially if you're not used to it. It's doubly hard to do it through a camera, especially if you're not used to it, again. So try to make it easier for you guys in that regard, and then it makes the shots a little bit easier for me. The shotgun is choked modified, so it's not a terrible choke to be using for as close as we'll be to where the targets will be shot. And again, the other thing we'll be watching for is this gun has a malfunction. It tends to have, it had this with the original forend, so it's certainly not a fault of the printed forend, but it will have a hang up where sometimes rounds won't get picked up high enough by the carrier, and then it locks the whole gun up. And we'll see what a nightmare that is to try and fix whenever you don't have a charging handle. Hopefully we'll run into that error. I'm pretty sure I know how to fix the error at this point, but I was waiting to fix it until I could film the video to sort of showcase probably part of why this gun got the reputation that it got, because especially back in the days of paper shells, getting a shotgun that ran reliably was sort of a difficult proposition in the first place. And with the sorts of jams that this gun can function, just from usual things like, in this gun's case, a spring being wore out, it's really obnoxious to have to try and clear this thing. So we'll go ahead, put one shell in the action, and then you press the toggle to release the bolt. And then it's pretty easy to load past that point. Remember from our earlier discussion, it's got sort of this intermediate position on the carrier, and there's no button to push to feed it either, which is a pretty cool system, admittedly. It is certainly more refined on loading than the Auto 5 itself is. And that's where the shells drop to in their ready position. Get ourselves set up here. Got the safety set to fire. Go ahead and see what we can do. First round, and we've already got this jam. So we can see here, the shell is sort of stuck between the carrier and the breech. I believe this happens as a result of the spring for the carrier. It is really weak compared to where it should be, and I think that it sort of bounces lamely whenever the shell goes to feed. Maybe we'll get some slow motion footage to see if we can confirm that here today, but that's sort of the hang up that this silly thing has. Of course, fixing this hang up is where you end up really understanding why the charging handle is so brilliant and why this is so dumb. Pulling back on the barrel won't solve this issue, because if you look at where the shell is, it's trapped between the barrel and the bolt. So how do you pull back on the bolt? Well, if you forgot to bring a tool, you're sticking your finger in the action, pulling back on the bolt, and you have to get it out of there quick before you get bit. And I have had this gun bite me as a result of doing that. So now we can lock the bolt back and see if the shell will feed. That time we did get the shell, but when cycling it will have trouble sometimes getting that shell to want to go. And best I can figure, that's just because of the spring for the carrier is worn out. It works about 70% of the time correctly, and then sometimes you have that particular jam happen. All right, and again, there is no magazine cutoff on this shotgun the way there is in the Auto 5, but unloading it is still very easy. As we'd shown before, simply push up on the carrier and you can get shells out that way. And you throw shells back in, like so. We'll go ahead, shoot the rest of the shells we got in the gun, see if we have any more malfunctions, and this time I won't address the malfunctions so much as I'll try to clear them as though I need to do it with some amount of time crunch. So I'll try and clear these malfunctions quickly, and we'll see where we go from there. There we go. The gun worked fine that time. All right, so we had a jam there at the end, and it looks like the trap thrower is hanging up now. Probably the battery just needs to be charged, but that'll sort of limit how quickly we can go through and shoot stuff with this. But you did see we had that jam that time, and it wasn't just as simple as a regular rack. And again, I'm just attributing that to the fact that the spring, something on the lifter, the carrier, doesn't actually work correctly. I think the carrier itself is in fine working order. I think it just comes down to either its spring or, and we'll talk about this in a separate video, I'm sure, as far as the guts of how this gun works. There's a lot of very little springs that are all like very funky shaped torsion springs. And that's what this gun relies on to work. And those springs are hard to get in and out of the gun. And then when they're in the gun, I don't think they ever really give as much spring pressure as their equivalents in the Auto 5, which are either flat springs or coil springs. But this is what Winchester came up with anyway. Ha! That one broke right out of the thrower. And there we go. A little bit of fun with the Winchester. Maybe we'll see if we can get some slow-mo footage and then go from there. We are now back inside here with our Winchester shotgun. Our shoulder has had time to recover from the beating that this gun gives you, even when shooting light loads. Sort of as showcased there, right? This gun actually jammed more than I expected it to, and I was kind of glad for that, because that way I could show you a big part of why the lack of a charging handle really screws this gun. When it cycles fine, it's really not that hard of a gun to wrangle, to keep running, to have fun with. When the gun has any sort of feeding hiccup, like we saw multiple times, it's just awful. In the videos where we sort of get into the guts of these guns and how specifically they work, we'll actually be able to see why this gun had feeding hangups in particular. Sort of as I mentioned, on the inside, this gun is not an Auto 5 at all. It's entirely a different gun, and there's not parts interchange. Everything here is actually relatively original. Winchester did a good job, right? They designed a shotgun from the ground up. But they didn't design things in the best possible way, and they didn't even really come close when it comes to the actual mechanism that gets the lifter to pop up. On this gun, I sort of found a burr on that. I think that burr is why the gun was having feeding trouble. I've smoothed it out, shot a few more rounds through it, but didn't have time to really beat on the gun to see if I could make it happen again. But it was really just one magazine, 5 rounds I put through it. It did do fine. So we'll have to see going forward, but generally speaking, I don't like shooting this thing a lot anyway. Mostly because it's uncomfortable, but then also because just the manual of arms isn't great. It's fun, but it's sort of fun in the same way that shooting a G3 for a long time is fun, where the upper body workout is great. The G3's sort of got a similar thing where it's got a great big charging handle that's way out there that you got to pull a long way back. Not so dissimilar from the way the charging handle, quote unquote, on this works, but it does exhaust you after a while, and you're sat there thinking, there's got to be a better way. In the case of the G3, there isn't really. There's not like a better way to having charging handle on a roller delayed 308, but for a shotgun, there's multiple substantially better ways to get around the sort of problem that exists with the patent for the charging handle on the Auto 5. So that's more or less the Winchester 1911 in a nutshell. You can find examples that don't have feeding issues, but it sort of is hit and miss. Parts for these guns are surprisingly easy to find, considering they came out of production a long, long time ago. But Winchester did devote enough production to having spare parts around. So Winchester made enough of the guns that it made sense for them to make spare parts, and you can still find those spare parts today. So if you do come across one of these days they're going up there in price, which is sort of funny. I think that it's, a lot of people, I'm not necessarily discluded from this group, like to buy bad guns just to see how bad they are. I wish that this video could have shown this gun only have a feeding issue like once, because prior to this gun having this feeding issue show up, which I have to assume had to do with that burr on its on the actual mechanism, the cam that kicks the lifter up as the bolt starts coming forward. Prior to it having that, it did run great. Again, it was uncomfortable to shoot, but the sort of safety issues, or you have to have superhuman upper body strength, or all of those sorts of stories, they really just don't pan out. Maybe some of that could be explained just sort of with again, in contemporary context. People back then were a lot smaller in stature than people now, right? I'm 6 foot big, and I can reach out to the barrel with the gun on my hip. I don't even have to have the gun on my hip, right? And I can get out to the barrel no problem. If you were like 5'6", that would be really awkward. So perhaps some of it in context, right, with people with shorter stature, it would be a lot harder gun to wrangle and keep running, but otherwise that's the Model 11. It's a nightmare to take apart. It's it leaves you wanting in a lot of ways compared to the Auto 5, but it is really cool to see, screwless receivers at the point that this gun came out was pretty close to unheard of for auto-loading arms. And in fact, screwless, technically this is a thumb screw and you have to undo that to take the gun apart, yeah. But there aren't any actual screws to have to take the gun apart. That's really cool, it's really novel, and that is the direction that gun design and manufacture would go after this, after the advent of this. And it's not because of this necessarily, but that's the direction that things would end up going, is easier to disassemble than the Auto 5, and not having a million different screws to get it past that initial stage of sort of transport disassembly or just taking the gun down. So there were a lot of good ideas here. Those good ideas didn't necessarily amount to much. However, there is one thing that those good ideas did amount to, and it's the Winchester 1911 Part 2. Unfortunately, it went even worse than the 1911 did in the first place. In the next video, we'll take a look at that shotgun, another of Winchester's, which really got killed off before it had a chance to run. There's a couple things we'll talk about in that video as far as... I've tried to do as much research as I can because the answers out there aren't great. At this point, I've bought like 4 different Winchester shotgun books to read what they each say, and read also what they try and source for why the shotgun that comes after this one was such a failure. But in that next video, we'll do a deep dive on that shotgun, sort of look at what I did to get mine working again, and of course, because it is working, we'll be able to shoot it a little bit. So stay tuned, because the whole screwless, awful to disassembleness, turns out Winchester, they could get worse. They could actually get a lot worse. So in the next video, we'll look at that one. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you are interested, I have a Patreon. You can find that in the description section. Also there in the description section, I'll have a spreadsheet, and in that spreadsheet I'll sort of pull out some tech specs of the guns and do some sort of rankings and general summaries of the things I say in the video, so like looking at overall length and weight and how hard they are to take apart. Now I'll add some comments in there, sort of rehashing some of the ideas that I came across in the videos, or things that I thought that the videos maybe lacked that I wanted to get in there that I forgot to get in there. But hopefully eventually, once I've got sort of more information pooled up there and I've talked about more guns, we can sort of do a tier list. And I'm sort of hoping that the tier list will be fun, just sort of for comical value, but also because, if you're a guy who likes the Auto 5, and maybe you want an Auto 5 that's got more features or is better in some way, we're going to run into shotguns that on the Auto 5 tier list will be ranked higher than the Auto 5. Just a fair warning, a spoiler alert there. There are better Auto 5s than the Auto 5 itself. Shocking. Well, we'll come across some of those. So if you're looking for more of a honest to goodness, excellent shotgun, even excellent by today's standards, right? Doing side-by-side comparison, we'll see some of those. We'll see shotguns that, personally, for both the sort of clay shooting as well as even for hunting, I've found shotguns, long recoil, that I prefer, even to your $1,500, your $2,000 Benellis and Berettas. I found shotguns that not only do I shoot better with, but I think even objectively, it's just fantastic guns. We'll come across them, we'll talk to them as we get to them, but if you're interested in the Auto 5 because it's sort of a slice of antiquity and you're sort of interested in more of those guns that are just weird, like, God, they put a million screws on it, or God, they put the charging handle on the barrel, we'll go ahead and come across some of those guns too. This is going to be the only one that's barrel cocking. Oddly enough, that system didn't show up anywhere, and you can't make a very good video series about the Winchester 1911 not guns, not 11s, 1911s, something like that. But there won't be much of that, but sort of the antiquity that you see baked into the Auto 5, we'll come across more guns that are also still a little bit of a pain to disassemble. So you guys can look forward to that, as far as like maybe if you're interested in buying some of the guns I talk about at some point. I'll at least try and give you some pointers, but I will do my best to avoid talking about dollar values because that stuff does fluctuate so much, and it shouldn't be about the money so much as having a really good time. But that's our Winchester 1911. I think it's an okay shotgun. I think it's a misunderstood shotgun. In the modern context, it's a real piece of shit. I think at the time, when your options for autoloaders were just Auto 5s, and depending on the gun catalog you looked at, these were a little bit cheaper than Auto 5s. I don't hate this shotgun. It's not a shotgun that I'm going to condemn as a steaming pile of garbage. But it could have done things better. It was close. It was close to something really, really good. It could have done a lot better. and it's a real shame that it didn't come close enough. And I hope that you guys won't take the fact that this one was having some feeding hangups that are hopefully, knock on wood at this point, resolved, as that's how all of these guns run. That's absolutely not the case. I have shot ones that have done 50 rounds in a day flawless, 75 rounds in a day flawless, and you, the shooter, after 75 rounds through one of these, won't want to shoot it anymore at that point. You will be entirely convinced that one of these has never jammed because you're not willing to abuse your shoulder bore to find out if it's going, that particular example is going to keep running on that day. But that's the Winchester 1911. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video, and you'll check out the Patreon if you want, and you'll check out the Excel sheet maybe if you're interested in these shotguns like me. But otherwise, I hope that you have a good day.